Hello, I'm Assistant Commonwealth's Attorney Dan Laren. I'm here once again with the case of the week. We try about 2,000 cases a year here in the Fayette Circuit Court. Every now and again, though, somebody comes through who's very unique, or we get a case where the facts are so unique that they stick out on our memory. And this is a case that Assistant Commonwealth's Attorney Andrea Mattingham-Williams and I dealt with that had such an individual. A gentleman by the name of Cuddy Holbrook. He first came to our office in 2008. Andrea, would you tell us about your case against Cuddy Holbrook?
Sure. Starting about June of 2007, various businesses here in Fayette County began receiving bad checks from a business known as RHR Stonemasons, and with a woman's signature, Mary Ann Lakin. All of the checks that were written here in Fayette County came back as bad checks. They were written in various other counties around the state also. When the investigation began, it was clear that Mary Ann Lakin was involved, but then an investigator started talking to various businesses and began to understand that there was a man involved in passing the bad checks, and that individual was the name Cuddy Holbrook. Both he and Miss Lakin were indicted in February of 2008, and at that point they were eventually picked up and the prosecution of both of those individuals began.
And how did those two different cases proceed through the system?
Both, Miss Lakin pled guilty, and she received a sentence, I think, of 4 years, 3 or 4 years, and she served that time in state prison and served it out, actually. And Mr. Holbrook wanted a jury trial. He represented himself and wanted to go to trial on his case.
And what were the issues that came up with Cuddy Holbrook representing himself as the case went through the system?
Well, he was originally indicted in 2008, but the case wasn't tried until 2012, actually August of 2012, so it was around for about 4 years. Much of that was due to Mr. Holbrook being transferred from various counties because he had charges in so many different counties around the state for the bad checks, but also due to his motion practice. He regularly filed motions in the case. He was awarded resources to investigate the case very thoroughly, and he did that, or had investigators do that, so he was successful in delaying the case for a few years.
Well, as it turns out, Cuddy Holbrook came up on my caseload in 2011, and it was a similar series of events. What it boiled down to is that he talked his mother out of some checks. He told her that he needed $100 for gas, and then he wrote himself a $20,000 business loan on her account. He bought a trailer for $10,000, and then he bought some other items, including a golf cart with these checks, which were all returned insufficient funds. He sold the golf cart to another friend of his and bilked her out of about $1,500. My case was similar in that Cuddy Holbrook demanded to represent himself and filed a serious pile of motions, although nothing like Andrea had to deal with, because she had to deal with him for 3 years. So our cases were set for trial pretty close to each other. Andrea, what happened in your case when it went to trial?
After a 4-day jury trial, the jury found Mr. Holbrook guilty of 6 counts of theft by deception, or being complicit in writing bad checks here in Fayette County. Mr. Holbrook was also a persistent felony offender in the first degree, with over 18 prior felonies for similar type offenses, including most of which were for bad checks, and that had been happening since 1985. So after the jury heard his long series of previous convictions, and after hearing the evidence after 4 days, they found him guilty of 6 counts. They gave him 10 years on each count to run consecutively for a total of 60 years.
And Andrea, in your experience, is 60 years an unusually large sentence for a financial crime?
Absolutely.
Well, I had a similar experience with Mr. Holbrook. My case went to trial a week or two after Andrea's did. Mr. Holbrook represented himself. He did testify during the trial. Basically, his defense in my case was that he meant to have the money. He just didn't have it in the bank when the checks went through that he wrote on his mother. The jury did not believe his story and convicted him. In my case, he was recommended a sentence of 40 years. Because he was on bond for Andrea's case and on parole for these crimes, these sentences have to run consecutively. One thing that happened in my case, and I think Andrea had a similar experience, is that Mr. Holbrook used his pro se attorney privileges to subpoena everybody he could, and it was a very routine thing for us to have court appearances where 10 or 15 witnesses would appear. Andrea, in your case, didn't they have to devote a courtroom to the witnesses he subpoenaed?
Yes, on the first morning of trial. Usually when you have an experienced licensed attorney, the Commonwealth's attorney and the defense attorney will often talk about how long I think my case will take or the Commonwealth's case will take, and then the attorney for the defendant will tell their witnesses to come on a particular day at a particular time. Mr. Holbrook, due to the fact that he didn't have that legal knowledge, subpoenaed all of his witnesses for the first day of trial, and they showed up, and we spent much of the morning giving the witnesses, or the judge spent much of the morning giving witnesses times to come back 2 or 3 days later. And it was unfortunate because many of the witnesses were from out of town.
I had a similar experience in that Mr. Holbrook subpoenaed a number of witnesses to my trial. Another thing that happened is those witnesses were particularly hostile to Mr. Holbrook and really didn't testify in a way that helped him very much.
That is accurate for my case as well.
So the jury heard Mr. Holbrook's case. By the time my case was finished, he had a total of 10 prior felony judgments with 26 prior felony convictions, mainly for theft by deception. By statute, Mr. Holbrook's penalties can only be 20 years because they're Class C and Class D felonies. So he was sentenced on these cases to 20 years each, run consecutively for a total of 40 years. He will go to prison because these are Class C felonies and include persistent felony offender offenses. He will do at least 10 years before he gets the opportunity for parole again. His record indicates 5 prior parole violations. And I asked the jury in my case to retire Cuddy Holbrook because he's in his early 50s and has spent almost 30 years writing bad checks. And apparently they agreed with the prosecution, and we consider Cuddy Holbrook retired from the business of writing bad checks here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I'm Assistant Commonwealth Attorney Dan Laren. This has been Case of the Week.